Hemlock woods are completely unlike any other types of forests that we have. It gives you a place to sit on a hot summer day that's as cool as any place you can find. And it gives you as quiet a spot as you can expect to find anywhere in the landscape.
So hemlock is slow growing, but it's also one of the longer lived species we have. And it's not uncommon at all to find hemlock in our area that are 200 years old or even older. I remember a few years ago, we cut a small hemlock tree. It was maybe 12 or 14 inches in diameter. And when we actually started counting the rings, I think it was 320 years old, which was unexpected. And had we known it was that old, we probably wouldn't have harvested it. But that just gives you an example of I guess in the race for sunlight, hemlock is the tortoise, not the hare.
I think they're gorgeous trees. I mean, if someone goes to Cook's Forest and sees this tree, and it's 200 years old, to comprehend that tree through that time, amazing. That is 3, possibly almost 4 times that a person's lifetime that tree continues to grow. And think of the effect that that particular tree has had in that surrounding area. It just boggles my mind.
It's in the way that hemlock is diversifying the world that we experience and that organisms experience that we find its importance, and of course we also find its beauty.
I have an individual tree that's my favorite tree, and it's a hemlock, but it's hard to describe it. It's hollow, but still alive, so it has like half its crown still there, but it's all hollow and rotten, and you just, about 60 feet, you can look through the trunk. You can just see sunlight through it because it's so dead and hollow, but it still has a few branches and it's hanging on. I like to think about the number of organisms that must be living inside of that tree, just the bacteria and the fungi and probably amphibians and things. I mean, that tree is just probably the host to so many different animals and organisms.
Hemlock is in such a critical position in its long history in the Northeast. For about the last 8,000 to 9,000 years, since it arrived in the Northeast, it has gradually become a dominant species and has been kind of continuously through that entire period. It's a long-lived species, it's shade tolerant, it's very competitive. And so once it became established, it became very important in many different landscapes and habitats. It was catastrophically and very abruptly decimated as a major part of the forest ecosystem 5,000 years ago for reasons or by processes that we don't fully understand, but that were clearly related to climate change, rapid climate change, and probably stresses by prolonged droughts. It then recovered, and then it was dealt a second really major blow by European settlement. Land clearance, very intensive harvesting for wood products and for tannins that were used in the leather industry. And then as agriculture declined and as alternatives to tannins were developed, it recovered yet again.
They're a unique tree that is very important, not only from an ecology standpoint, but from an economic standpoint because of our lumber industries here in Pennsylvania.
If you go over into Athens and Steuben Township north of Titusville, you'll find an Amish sawmill just about on every corner out there. They're utilizing hemlock and making lumber on a small sawmill basis. The larger sawmills deal with hemlock as they get it. But yeah, there are a lot of people who are utilizing hemlock to make boards out of it.
We harvest a fair amount of hemlock and typically we'll sell that either for low-grade pallet wood or to be used for barn siding, construction, things like that, sawn into dimensional lumber.
And so now it's beginning, really, its third major decline in the Northeast, this time from an insect.
Yeah, so Hemlock woolly adelgid is a small invasive insect that was brought into this country, we think, early in the 1950s, probably into Richmond, Virginia, based on records that we have. It's an insect that feeds exclusively on hemlock species, Carolina hemlock down in the southern Appalachians, and then eastern hemlock, which has a broad range from Georgia to Canada. You can flip up the branch, look at the underside of the branch, because that's where it's located. And the adults will form a white woolly substance that protects it and its eggs. And so it's a very small insect. I liken it to like the size of a pepper grain. When you pour out some pepper, you know, that's about the size of these things. So unlike some insects that actually chew on needles and things like that, this insect inserts a long feeding tube into the base of the needle, into the twig. And so it feeds on storage material and basically depletes the reserves, preventing it from forming new buds, new needles, which are the machinery to capture resources. So you end up with fewer and fewer needles that can support that tree and ends up basically starving and dying off.
And then depending on the site and location and climate, the tree gradually succumbs.
In a pretty short order, decades probably, we could lose a vast majority of the range of this once very dominant species.
Everyone thinks about Hemlock woolly adelgid as the little, I always think of it as a Q-tip on, you know, on the edge of the hemlock needle. But they do have, the immature stage is mobile. So they're moving around, they're hitching rides on wind, they're hitching rides on animals, on birds, and so they're moving around that way. And then the other way they're moving around is people, right? We're really good at moving things around. We like firewood, we like nursery stock. So transplanting a hemlock tree from one place to another, if it has HWA on it, that's immediately going to be introduced into this new habitat. And so between all of those things, you get a pest that can move pretty quickly and that is difficult to stop in its tracks.
We locally have been hearing about Hemlock woolly adelgid coming this way for a long period of time. The only confirmed location in the northwest part of the state that I'm aware of at present is at Cook's Forest.
And once that was found, it was actually a team of people, including some Forest Service people, who made that original discovery. And then they came on to adjacent national forest lands and found the adelgid there. But people had enough information about adelgid before it even arrived here to form a really exciting coalition to identify in advance where the most important pieces of hemlock forest were located as the core areas for a treatment program once the Adelgid showed up. But everybody was involved, and they had these big meetings where people would come and sit down with maps together and say, oh, I know that place, it's a really important cold water stream, or oh, Heart's Content obviously has to be on the map because it's this old growth remnant forest. All of those different recreational, historical, cultural values that hemlock provides were identified in a systematic way. It's really an exciting effort. They've actually received funding from the federal government to institute a treatment program that'll focus on those areas that identified as part of that network.
You can indeed protect individual trees through either a chemical spray or a stem injection or pouring a chemical around the tree. It's basically a systemic chemical that the tree takes up, and then the insect ends up feeding on that and killing off the Adelgid. It would need to be repeated every couple years, but the good news is you can protect individual trees. The bad news is you have to repeat it and it costs money, but it can be done.
Insects can reproduce so quickly. I mean, they can have multiple life cycles in a season. They're reproducing quickly, they're adapting really quickly. I mean, that's one reason that we're seeing a huge impact on a tree, on a forest. There have been some biocontrol agents that they've tried with HWA, but you have to put something in the system that's going to be able to reproduce and keep up. The idea behind a biocontrol agent is that you want it to become natural in that setting. You don't want to have to go and release them on a yearly basis. You want them to become an integrated part of the system, because then you get this whether it's a predator, so something that's actually eating the pest, or whether it's a parasitoid, which is actually laying its eggs in that pest, so that the young are actually hatching in the pest and developing on it. So either or, you want that to become part of that ecosystem so that you have consistent control.
There are trees in the Delaware Water Gap where the hemlock woolly adelgid has been for 20 years. There are study plots where hemlock survival is 80%. So I'm hopeful that between cold winters and a pretty aggressive treatment plan, that we may be able to sustain enough hemlock on the landscape that as scientists develop better biological controls or find individual genotypes that are resistant to the effects of the adelgid, that we'll be able to bring hemlock back on this landscape.
The hemlock canopy provides that cool shade in the summer and also as shelter during heavy snowfall. If you walk through, you'll see deer bedded down underneath hemlock or turkey. It provides that shelter as well as food, and it's a real necessity in many of our areas.
Winter survival is all about energy. It's about finding enough food to keep yourself going and having enough energy to avoid predators if you need to. The thermal cover that a hemlock stand can provide physically, and just keeping snow off of you, keeping wind off of you, will prevent energy loss, and it'll increase your chances for survival. With 2 feet of snow in a hardwood stand and less than a foot of snow in a hemlock stand, you know, wildlife's going to utilize that lower snow condition to shelter. They'll expend less energy, you know, just moving around and staying out of the snow, keeping warm, where they have some canopy protection from hemlock.
Deer are an interesting animal in the fact that they are very adaptable. Actually, one of their preferred food is white pine. Also, any of the herbaceous material on the forest floor. If they're really stressed, they'll eat almost anything, including beech. Beech is normally not on their list, but if they're stressed, I mean, they'll eat to maintain their nutrition. Interesting story, I was with a deer biologist with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. We were on a study area, and one of the deer came up behind me, and I was eating a bologna sandwich. And they were talking about how deer are so selective in what they eat, and and of course I was doing my thesis work. And the deer was behind me, and I just held out the bologna sandwich, and it ate it. So, just when you think you have that particular animal or species that you're studying figured out, they do something to, kind of shock therapy for you.
Our forests are resilient. They will change, but they won't go away. So you might see hemlock go. I'm hopeful we can hold on to it, but we'll have a forest that just might be a little different than what we're used to.
In your mind, it's a final, but it's not. And over, and you can, go out to the Midwest where they had the fires, and you have the barren ground, and all of a sudden you start getting the plants and the flowers coming back and the tree seedlings coming back. So it's not final, it's not the climax, it's not the end. It's changing as you and I speak. And if we lose the hemlock, that diversity is going to change. But will something take its place? Will it improve it better? Will it make it worse? I don't know.
I think it's those characteristics of being dark and maintaining moisture that are really going to be significant losses. From a human perspective, walking through a hemlock forest has a different feel to it than walking through any other type of forest.
For each of us, it's very painful to see these hemlock forests die. And it may seem equally catastrophic to lose a species that's so distinctive.
I would think that our grandchildren would be a little ticked off if we here in 2015 had the opportunity to save a bunch of hemlocks and we just, I'm really not interested in doing that.
We have to take it absolutely seriously. It's really important. It's great to have a coalition and a strategy, but it's not a hopeless situation.
There's nothing that can replace hemlock. And yet, in 20 years going through a forest that used to have hemlock, you'll never notice the difference. You'll never go through and say, oh, there should be hemlock here, any more than anybody walked through the Harvard forest and says, where's the chestnut? Right? The woods seem like they're functioning perfectly well. And as ecosystems they are, it gets us into a really interesting discussion about nature and the way that it operates and how human values cloud our understanding of that function. The forests just keep growing, and the carbon just keeps cycling, and the nutrients just keep cycling, and water keeps flowing. And we feel the pain. And some species may increase and some species may decrease, but the forest just continues.